Good morning and welcome to the session on online marketplaces. I'm Aoife White, a reporter at Bloomberg News in Brussels. When I look outside of my home office window, I see plenty of delivery vans dropping off parcels to my neighbours. This year has been a huge interest in the last year for online commerce and even explosive growth for some platforms as we're confined to our homes. It also highlights why trust matters and how we should tackle problems when things go wrong for a consumer, either with the seller or with the platform that hosts them. Many of these issues aren't new: unsafe or counterfeit products, who is liable, how should existing rules be enforced. But we're now dealing with them on an extremely wide scale after a year when we've seen panic buying, huge consumer demand for some items, and a surge of interest in products none of us ever needed before, like this one. We're very lucky to have a panel with very wide experience on teasing out these issues. We're going to start with Werner Steng, who must be known to most of you as a European Commission official who's been carefully considering online platforms for years. He now advises Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager on digital issues as a member of her cabinet. He will explain what the Commission's thinking was in marketplaces when it designed the Digital Services Act last year. Then we'll hear from Albert Liu, Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of Alibaba Group, one of the world's most extensive marketplaces, and someone who can also tell us how marketplaces are changing based on some of the different ways consumers in Asia are now buying online. Another view comes from one of the leaders of European luxury brands, Chanel. Fabienne Weibel is the Associate General Counsel and Head of Public Affairs for Chanel and can tell us what risks brands see in this area. One of the most innovative of the national antitrust and consumer regulators in Europe is the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets. Edwin van Houten is the director of the Consumer Department, and he'll talk about some of the issues the ACM has raised with legislation here and how the DSA may interact with existing rules. We're going to start with a short round from each speaker, introducing his or her perspective. We'd very much welcome questions from the audience, so please put them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can later in the session. Over to you, Werner.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss the DSA. Before zooming into the marketplace issue, probably just a few words still of introduction, because that, of course, is happening. All the provisions on marketplaces that we're discussing today are in the broader context of the DSA. Just to recall the different objectives of the DSA, because all of this has been a balancing act, as you can imagine. The one is certainly trust. That's obvious. Restore trust in the online marketplace. Make sure that consumers feel safe when they buy online. The second is fairness. That's also about level playing field, that traders that are competing with platforms where products may not always be in tune with our product standards and other regulations can compete on equal terms. The third is a growth objective. Also, the session itself is called Online Marketplaces, Promoting Trade and Protecting Consumers. It's always both. We want to secure the single market for the benefit of all, for platforms, for the platform economy, for many, many traders that depend on platforms and sell through platforms, many of which are SMEs. And of course, us consumers, that in spite of all the risks and downsides of some of the products that we're seeing, we still benefit from enormous choice that we didn't have before the platform economy. Last but not least, probably a bit less relevant here, is the democracy point, that we have greater transparency and democratic oversight over the activities of large platforms of all kinds that affect our lives in many regards. Now, zooming into the marketplace issue, the problem is, of course, the disintermediation that we have seen, especially when it comes to imports into the EU, because now we have those online marketplaces that, as I said, of course, bring many benefits for traders and for consumers, but have also led to a disintermediation of traditional supply chains, if you want. In the good old world, good in inverted commas, when you relied on importers and retailers, responsibilities were clear for everybody in the chain, and the consumer felt pretty safe, I guess, at the end of this chain. Now, of course, we have online marketplaces that have stepped in, that are intermediaries, that say, well, we are just intermediaries. We are shielded from liability because it's user-generated content. And they also have millions of sellers and even more products going through them. Those products are also often shipped through, in parcels through the postal chain, meaning also that market surveillance authorities, customs authorities, find it difficult to control what is coming in, what is coming on the market. Are these products compliant? Are taxes paid? Are products safe? And so on. And the consumer probably often doesn't know actually whom he's buying from. Of course, you can, if you are a diligent consumer, you will find out. But often people would think, well, if I'm allowed to buy on this platform, I'm sure I'm being taken care of, and there is no risk in consuming products through this platform. Now, we're trying to fix a lot of those issues with the Digital Single Market Act, while not changing the liability framework as such for many reasons, which we are certainly going to touch upon in the discussion. We have clearly stepped up the responsibilities of the marketplaces in many regards. So whether it is sort of already encouraging more proactive measures where these are appropriate, for instance, to identify fake products or counterfeit products through the Good Samaritan clause, the more reactive part in terms of notice and takedown, a clear obligation to have such systems in place and remove illegal content when made aware of this. Trusted flaggers, which means then that those that really can identify more easily, more reliably what is illegal on a platform would get preferential treatment. We have, of course, the traceability requirements that there is much more required now of the platforms in terms of authentication of traders that are selling through the platform even before they start doing so. The repeat infringer provisions, which sort of say that if the same trader, illegal or rogue trader, comes in again and again, well, they have to be suspended from the platform. We have a better interface with law enforcement, public enforcement authorities, that if they issue orders against a platform, then those orders have to be fulfilled very quickly. And last but not least, also the information that flows to the consumer itself will be much better. A lot of the information that is collected from the trader is passed on to the consumer. And we are also facilitating the way in which mandatory information that needs to be passed to the consumer will also be more visible on the platforms. So that is a whole range of measures that, seen collectively, we feel will rectify a lot of the problems that we're seeing today without undermining the principal business case of the online intermediation system. And with that, I already can stop my first introduction.
Thank you very much. Albert, could we hear from you?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I'm very, very excited to be on the panel here today, and hope all of you are keeping safe and healthy during this COVID period. Thank you, Werner, for your sharing just now. Trying to strike the right balance between the interests of so many constituencies is never easy. So I'm actually very glad I don't have to do your job. I will lightly touch on three topics: a brief background of Alibaba Group, its marketplace business model, and its platform governance measures, which align well with the purpose and direction of the DSA. Secondly, how we see commerce rapidly evolving and its implications on legislation like the DSA. And then thirdly, just some brief thoughts on the DSA itself. Firstly, Alibaba Group's mission is to make it easy to do business anywhere. We enable businesses to transform the way they market, sell, operate, and improve their efficiencies. Our businesses comprise of core commerce, cloud computing, digital media and entertainment, and innovation initiatives. Alibaba Group has a user reach of over 1 billion global annual active consumers. In Europe, we act as a gateway to China for European brands and small and medium-sized businesses seeking to enter the huge China market. Conversely, our AliExpress marketplace connects third-party sellers with customers all over the world, including those in Europe. Now, as a marketplace, AliExpress's platform governance efforts focus on managing online listings and not physical products. That is because, unlike sellers on our platform, we don't come into contact with the goods, nor do we have any way to test or assess individual product functions. As Commissioner Vestager astutely noted recently, if one were to say platforms were to have the responsibility as an importer, one would not have platforms anymore. They'd be like traders, like the people they host on the platform. And that's absolutely true. platforms and sellers are not the same. Nevertheless, we support regulations such as the DSA that are appropriately tailored to our platform and to how platforms operate. And we have a corresponding strong interest to eliminate fraudulent sellers and illicit product listings. Thus, we implement a wide range of protective measures, for example, by regularly scanning RAPIX, working with brands to fight counterfeits, working with market surveillance authorities on notifications of unsafe or non-compliant products, and by having in place governance rules aimed at preventing illicit product listings, including applying a system of penalties leading up to the permanent closure of the shops of any repeat violators on our platform. Next, I'd like to share a perspective on the evolution of commerce and the potential implications on regulations such as the DSA. We see the rapid rise of new retail that is enabling a seamless engagement between the online and offline world. It's not about converting online users to offline customers or vice versa, or replacing brick and mortar shopping with online shopping, but rather the blending of multiple channels in a way that puts the consumer at the center, often in new and unexpected ways. For example, we've helped brands such as IKEA with our 3D showroom technology to create a virtual walkthrough of a full IKEA store experience for their online shoppers. We're also working with the millions of physical convenience stores across China to help digitize their businesses, better cater to their local customers' needs through data analytics, and effectively compete with online sellers on our own marketplaces. We also see the explosive growth in Asia of shoppertainment. This is a combination of social media, entertainment, and e-commerce. Live streaming is a huge trend in China and Southeast Asia today, and for products that one wouldn't expect. It's not just cosmetic brands like Estee Lauder that are using live streaming to promote their best sellers, but also traditional brick and mortar retail live streaming from within their physical stores, to the more extreme of farmers broadcasting from rural villages to showcase their fresh produce, and for consumers to be able to click and buy directly within the live stream broadcast. We see this trend now actually starting to catch on in Europe as well. Just last week, we actually released a study by Forrester and AliExpress, which found that 70% of consumers surveyed in France, Spain, Poland, and the UK expressed interest in this new form of online shopping. And European consumers seem to have very different habits. French consumers prefer content that is succinct and endorsed by influencers, while shoppers in Spain look for the best deals and practical information. And consumers in Poland value interactions with hosts and other consumers the most, while UK consumers emphasize trustworthy and entertaining content that is mobile friendly. So all this is to really say that markets and commerce models are constantly evolving and often in ways that are difficult to predict. So we strongly believe that legislation such as the DSA needs to be future-proof, such as by taking the horizontal approach that it does toward platforms. That's also why we don't support the exclusion of small enterprises, as we see technology enabling more small enterprises to reach more online consumers. Product safety should not depend on where the customer brought the product, but really should be ensured across all platforms. Finally, just to share a few other comments on the DSA itself. We do welcome the DSA being a regulation, as we expect this to lead to a harmonized approach across the EU, which truly supports the single market. We're also supportive of the Know Your Business Customers principle, where we conduct very thorough screenings of our merchants today. We also have some suggested improvements to the hosting, notifications, transparency obligations, and trusted flaggers provisions to reflect the practicalities of platform implementation, which we can discuss during the course of this conversation. But I want to stop here and pass the microphone on to the other panelists for their opening remarks. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Could we please hear from Fabienne?
Hey everybody, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this event. It's a pleasure to be with you. So maybe some general remarks about the DSA before I go into a bit of details about some of the measures which are proposed. Clearly, the DSA is a unique opportunity to review the general principles governing online intermediaries liability. The rules of the DSA will be valid for many years to come, and that's why it's so important that we get them right. And it's even more important with the ongoing sanitary crisis, because we know that European citizens increasingly use the internet for most of their needs, and so we need to make sure that they're safe. Counterfeiting obviously is a very old issue, but it's still growing, and I will just share a couple of figures. In 2019, the OECD found that counterfeit products represent almost 7% of all EU imports, with almost 40% growth compared to 2016. Loss of jobs, loss of taxes, social contributions for governments, harm to the environment. I mean, the negative consequences of IPR infringement are manifold. And even though I represent a luxury company, it's really key to understand that counterfeiting is not just a luxury products issue. Footwear, cosmetics, toys, medicine, chemicals, phone, alcohol, everything is being counterfeited. And the problem is that fake goods are not subject to the same quality standards, and that for certain type of goods, such as cosmetics or food, there are potential health risks for consumers. Like most rights owners, we've been working for many years with online platforms, and collaboration with online platforms is very important, but we strongly believe that voluntary measures are not sufficient, and that we need a strong legal framework with legally binding obligations imposed on platforms. And I know the subject of this session is marketplaces, but I think it's important, as many others said this morning, to say that it's not just about marketplaces. Counterfeiters, unfortunately, increasingly use social networks, messaging services, website builder services to promote and sell their products. So that's something that needs to be taken into account in the DSA. Another word about the horizontal approach chosen by the Commission for the DSA. We understand the approach, but at the same time, it's really important also to understand there is a fundamental difference between illegal products and illegal information, such as fake news or hate speech. The sale of products online has nothing to do with free speech. It poses no threats to the fundamental rights of EU citizens. And that's why we believe online products should be subject to very strict rules aimed at protecting consumers and IP rights. And we believe that this is possible under the current form of the DSA. So about the DSA itself, there are some very interesting provisions, but we also believe, and that will come to no surprise to you, that there is also room for improvement to better protect consumers and brands. And the main areas for improvement are the following. So the Commission has chosen not to impose general proactive measures on platforms, and we're a bit disappointed. And if this cannot be changed, we would still advocate at a minimum for the creation of a stay-down mechanism in the DSA. What does that mean? The issue we have today is that fraudsters keep on posting the same illegal content over and over again. And we rights owners, such as other third parties, keep on notifying that content over and over again to platforms. And in the meantime, consumers are left exposed. So we would really like online platforms to be required to make their best efforts to prevent the reappearance of illegal content which was previously notified. And we believe this is completely compatible from a legal standpoint with the absence of a general monitoring obligation, because it would be applicable to specific types of content. Also, from a technical or practical standpoint, it's also feasible, because we know there are many tools available which are based on keywords and image recognition, which would allow platforms to do just that. And to complement the stay-down mechanism, we also need a strong repeat infringer policy. There is a proposal in the DSA, and Werner alluded to that earlier, but we believe that it's a bit weak, because Basically, the platforms have the obligation to issue a prior warning to repeat infringers, and I'm not sure that they deserve that, to be honest. The text also refer to a suspension for a reasonable period of time, while indefinite suspension should be allowed. There is also no clear definition of the frequency of violations, which would justify a suspension measure. So in other words, we believe that we need stronger rules, and a 3 strike and you're out rule could be considered in this respect. Then KYBC, obviously on principle, we're extremely supportive. It's just that we believe that the current proposal is a bit too limited. We believe it should be applied not just to marketplaces, but to all types of online intermediaries, including, for example, advertising services and also domain name registers. All these intermediaries, which basically allow third parties to engage in commercial transactions with consumers. Another thing is that it should also apply to private sellers as much as professional sellers, because we believe that people who buy from private sellers need to be protected as much as if they were buying from professional sellers. And for that, they need a verified seller identity that they can rely upon to enforce their rights. And it's also technically feasible because we know that a significant number of platforms in many different sectors actually already implement identity verification measures, and I think Alibaba is one of them. Then the trusted flagger mechanism, it's something that certain platforms already use with rights owners, and it's extremely helpful. And that's why it should be clarified in the DSA that individual rights owners, such as Chanel, can get the benefit of this mechanism and not just their representative associations, because clearly we're best placed to guarantee the authenticity of our goods. And it should also be clarified that trusted flaggers notices should be given priority treatment, both in terms of more rapid action and also consideration. Finally, transparency is already very much present in the DSA, but there's one thing that's missing. It's that intermediaries should be required to inform the buyer of a product, which was later removed as being illegal. Because at the moment, when an illegal product is being removed from a platform, the platform knows, the seller knows, sometimes the person that's notified the product knows, but the buyer doesn't know. And we believe that's a loophole that needs to be closed. So as a conclusion, some very interesting principles are laid down in the proposed DSA, but we believe that further improvements are needed to better protect European consumers and brands. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Fabienne. Could we bring in Edwin for the ACM's view on this?
Yes, thank you very much, Ivy, and thanks to the previous speakers for their introductions, and of course the inspiration we had this morning in the earlier sessions. Well, from the ACM's perspective, let's give my view on where we stand with the DSA at the moment. Of course, in the past year of the COVID crisis, we've all witnessed how online platforms have firmly established themselves as pivotal players in the consumers' lives and in economic decisions consumers make. And this year has accelerated trends that have been ongoing for many years already. And in those years, we've seen search platforms and social media platforms move from mere sellers of advertisement space, and social media platforms move from moving into conductors of commercial ecosystems. We've seen commerce platforms developing from message boards into more active intermediators in transactions, and we've seen online shops moving from direct selling to roles as intermediary platforms. Not because they want to get rid of their customers, of course, their direct customers, or better said, the customer relationship. Quite the contrary. By becoming a platform, it was possible to expand a customer base and to reinforce ownership of customer relationships through, for instance, payment services, through delivery, management of feedback systems, etc. And in all those cases, platform services and commercial practices vis-a-vis businesses and consumers have become more and more central in the business to consumer experience. Well, the COVID crisis last year has also spurred illegal commercial practices online. Some people and companies abuse the opportunities the online world offers. I'm thinking of sales of illegal and unsafe products, scams, and misleading practices, misleading claims as well. This has even further highlighted the need to align platforms' legal liability and their responsibilities with their expanding role in B2C relations. It is in this regard not surprising, of course, that the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets, the ACM, welcomes the DSA proposal of the European Commission. We seriously think that the DSA definitely will help to make online platforms a safer and a happier place for online consumers. First of all, the obligation for platforms to have a single point of contact and a legal representation in the EU will promote more effective cross-border enforcement. For instance, in 2019, when BIUC called upon the CPC authorities to investigate AliExpress for breaches of EU consumer law, it took us some time to find out whether we could legally address the Amsterdam Alibaba office. Fortunately, we found a company willing to cooperate with us. The proposed DSA obligations, however, definitely provide more clarity and prevent companies from outside the EU from escaping scrutiny and enforcement. Secondly, the non-applicability of the hosting exemption for online marketplaces and other B2C platforms is a very welcome clarification and a tightening of rules. It may meet our call to the Commission in the consultation phase to consider liability for non-conformity of goods sold through the platform when the platform fails to comply with certain duties. However, we do think that the exact scope of this provision should be further clarified, but there's time for that, of course. Thirdly, we are happy with the Know Your Business customer provision. And I do recommend platforms to apply this provision actively to third parties who fail to comply with their self-certified compliance. These points being made, I would like to stress something else. I would like to stress that we should not underrate responsibilities that online platforms already have under current consumer protection rules, like the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and the Unfair Terms Directive. The ACM and other EU authorities have scrutinized online platforms also under these rules. And while the DSA will take some time to be concluded, we will continue to do so. We are actually convinced that some of the diligence obligations provided for in the DSA proposal may already apply under the professional diligence clause in the UCPD. For example, the ACM has recently issued rules of thumb in which it states that online platforms should take measures that ensure that professional users comply with consumer law. Depending on the circumstances of a case, these measures may include a proactive check of the user's contract terms and reprimands against actors that don't comply. So that brings me to the last issue I would like to touch upon. That concerns transparency provisions regarding targeted advertisements and, of course, for very large platforms, recommender systems. In our contribution to the DSA consultation, the ACM has called for a realistic approach towards transparency and for measures that ensure meaningful transparency. I've noticed that the word meaningful has found its way to the text of this provision, but to put meaning into practice, more is needed. The EU, national governments and authorities should invest in behavioral research into effective transparency and in stimulating a dialogue between the scientific community, policymakers, legislators, and companies about these issues. And still, these investments alone would not allow us to counter the information position that providers of data-intensive information services, and as such a lot of platforms, have and will keep also under the new rules. So we actually think that businesses should use their information position and their technical capabilities not only to increase conversion from a marketing perspective, but also to increase the effectiveness of transparency requirements. We have advocated to shift the burden of proof to providers. Providers, platforms, should allow that information disclosures are understood by consumers. They should show that it is really understood, that consumers understand what is being meant with all the information they get. So consumers really take it into account when they make their decisions about transactions. We would definitely welcome such a shift, because the effectiveness of transparency requirements towards consumers should be an essential part of the design process of online interfaces. And of course, I heard Albert Liu already say something about transparency issues in the new DSA, and I'd be very happy to experience together if there would be points that would make this more effective in practice, so that consumers really benefit from transparency. So I'm looking forward to hearing the views of my fellow panelists and others on these topics as well. And thank you very much.
Werner, I'm afraid I'm bouncing back to you, since this is your proposal. One thing that's come up in some of the initial comments is about scope and about the decision to focus on larger platforms. Could you describe a little bit why you did that? I mean, from the things that Albert was talking about, we can see that social media is being used more, that we're seeing different sales channels, but we're also seeing individual sellers. We're seeing some sites that are very small, maybe low value sales or secondhand sales. Why did you draw the line where you did? And is there room in the proposal to expand that if you see issues emerging in other channels?
Yeah, thank you. As I said from the beginning, this is always a balancing act, of course. Yeah, you can regulate in many different ways, and the negotiations with the other institutions will show whether we found the right balance. So, I mean, this was our proposal. Our proposal is based on the concept of risk, being risk-based, if you want. Yeah, it's also proportionate in a way if you're trying to rebalance the different interests in the ecosystem. And I mentioned that it's the whole ecosystem we're looking at. It is all those that provide digital services, and we also want to see a growth of digital service providers in Europe based on our single market. We have those millions of companies that can sell more than ever before in this multi-channel environment, of course, that we all know. I mean, before the platform economy was there, a small SME in Austria would probably sell to Germany at most, and now they can sell to all over Europe, if not globally. And then again, the consumers on the other hand. So that is why we need this proportionate approach, in our opinion, and risk-based. Of course, you can say it's an oversimplification that size is always we're not saying it's the only vector, if you want, yeah, but we're saying it's an important one. If you are a micro enterprise and you are entering the market and you are starting to grow, of course, you will have consumers that may be affected if you're not acting responsibly. But it's still different whether such a small startup is causing problems, or whether things coming through Alibaba or Amazon or eBay or Rakuten come on the market, because that's just it's so many more products that the scale of the problem is very different. That does not mean, however, that small companies can do what they want. I mean, first of all, even in the DSA, of course, we are not excluding them from the first part of the proposal, which is that they have to have a notice and action system in place. They have to inform those whose content was removed, and they can be punished like any other platform through the DMA sanction mechanism if they don't do this. That's already a step change compared to today, because we always talk about the liability framework of today, but that's a very indirect incentive to act responsibly, because it just says if you don't act, then you would lose any liability preference limitation that you may enjoy. But then still, liability has to be established somewhere else, and someone has to take you to court. Now, if you don't have those systems in place, you will be punished for not having those systems. You're also still bound by all the existing legal rules. They're not operating in a legal vacuum. as Edwin said himself, there is a body of law there that needs to be respected and can be enforced. We are just, through the DSA, trying to improve the enforceability throughout the ecosystem with a specific focus there where the negative impact is greatest. Last comment on this part of the debate. We always say marketplaces, but things are also sold on social media companies. Well, they are covered as well. This is just a shortcut here when we say, well, this is a marketplace sort of part of the proposal. But you all know, of course, it says where an online platform allows consumers to conclude distance contracts with traders. It is, of course, this consumer protection element, and it does not matter what type of online platform allows such transactions to happen. So whether they happen on Facebook or on Alibaba doesn't matter. They are covered by those provisions. So it's not a carve out for any other online platforms. I stop here.
Very much like to have more. If anyone would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat and I'll put it to the panelist. We have a question from Alexis Waravka of Independent Retail Europe, and he was asking why there isn't more of a risk-based approach on dangerous products, and where the risk of finding illegal products on a platform is the same as in a physical shop. Should the obligations not be lighter and adjusted to this low risk? He's saying that some cooperative platforms don't allow non-EU based third-party traders with no physical shops in the EU. Werner, I could be unkind and ask this to you again if you don't mind, and maybe we could follow up if someone else, maybe Edwin, also wanted to address this briefly.
First of all, there's limits as to how nuanced we can be in the DSA, which covers so many different situations. Yeah, we are already saying sort of the risk-based approach that I described before is based sort of on the sheer volume, and the greater the volume you have, the more actions you need to take. But once again, in this DSA, we are not defining here what is illegal and how illegal it is, right? This is a procedural proposal that says how the due processes that a platform has to put in place to act responsibly. We're neither defining here what is illegal or harmful. That's also part of another debate on the DSA. We're not saying what disinformation is and what they should do with fake news. We are just saying how they should organize themselves to act responsibly. And again, there's the other framework in place. I mean, the market surveillance regulation that will also enter into force shortly also clearly describes under what circumstances an economic operator needs to be in the European Union for a trader that is established outside. These things all continue to exist, which is why the traceability provision, for instance, also says where an economic operator is required under the market surveillance regulation, that is information that needs to be collected at the stage of authentication of the trader.
Yeah, if I could add a little bit to that, Werner. Thank you very much, and Ivy as well. Invite you to follow up on that. From a enforcement perspective, I think it's I can really understand the question. So, how far is everything risk-based in these proposals? But from an enforcement perspective, I'd like to look at it a different way. When you make sure as a company, whether you're small or big or whatever, if you make sure and you are convincing that you have your own stuff in order, then there is no problem. And actually, it's about, I already said something about sharing the burden of proof. I think it gives enforcers a lot of confidence in platforms, big or small, if they are able to convince how they have organized their compliance. And it's also about a compliance culture, and if that is set and you have you can be more confident about it, then you can also take a step back from an enforcement perspective. Anyway, that's part of the future development that we would really like to investigate together with companies. Also from the transparency perspective that I talked about earlier.
I had a little follow-up, Edwin, about transparency, about what that means. I mean, is that something that you chart, how much people understand the kind of contract they're making buying online? I mean, how do you see that as appropriate?
Yes, sorry,
how do you see that
I was
people
on mute.
understand what they've done?
On this big versus small platform, just maybe one quick comment. On principle, I'm a bit concerned that consumers using smaller platforms will enjoy a lesser degree of protection if we focus our efforts on the big platforms. And also there is a risk in practice that fraud will move from the big platforms to the small platforms. So this is really something that needs to be taken into account to ensure that there is a set of basic requirements that apply to all platforms, regardless of their size.
Yeah,
Albert?
I'll just chime in. I'll just chime in as well too. I mean, I agree with Fabian and Edwin on this, because we actually see technologies enabling progressively more smaller platforms, enterprises to sell and reach more online consumers. So, I agree. We really ought to look at from a safety and risk perspective, because I do think placing that obligation on whether it's large or smaller platforms, if our ultimate goal is to protect consumers, and I think it is a fair burden also to have smaller sellers who are now enabled by technology to reach more and more folks, that they ought to also ensure that their products are safe for those consumers as well. So I think we're at least a few of us sound like we're aligned in that approach and regard.
And one could even say that it's a cost of doing business, right? Because if you're in the business of putting people in contact and taking a share commission on the transaction, then you should at least ensure that you know who the parties are, that you have verified their identity, that you have done what you could, maybe in a way that's proportionate to your resources, but you have done what you could to ensure the parties are safe. I think that's an argument that should be made.
Yeah, and the most important argument you both make as well, I guess, is that you should take the consumer's perspective in regard. So we're talking, of course, and that's very understandably, about businesses and companies and what is a reasonable load, a reasonable burden. But in the end, the consumer rights are whether you shop with a small or a bigger platform. In both ways, they should be secure. I feel we've lost Ivy.
Yeah. Well, Ivy, I think was just asking all of us a question about sort of transparency and where we see that. I think maybe she was addressing that partly to you, Edwin. But I'll maybe just jumpstart it. For us, and looking at transparency, first of all, that's something we certainly do support, and I think DSA does a good job in requiring online platforms to be more transparent with consumers. And I see transparency really in a number of different ways that are covered, right? One thing I know you mentioned, Edwin, was this working experience you had with AliExpress, where initially you had a hard time sort of finding a single contact point, right, within the EU, and that's something now going forward the DSA will require. So part of transparency is sort of regulators knowing how they can reach a platform, how they can quickly, right, work with the platform if something does happen, right? So that's one part of transparency. The other part, obviously, within the DSA, the KYC on businesses, of course, that also forces the platform to do more diligence on the sellers on the platform, and that's also a form of transparency in terms of providing that information to consumers, right? And by the way, AliExpress, we do that. We've been doing that, actually, probably leading the pack on that versus other platforms in terms of seller KYC. And the third part, of course, around the actual reporting of statistics, etc. That part we also support. I think the only thing we comment on there is there may be certain business statistics that would be appropriate to just be provided to regulators versus publicly on the site, to the extent that it's data that is competitive sensitive. We probably would want to have some clarifications around whether certain types of data should just be made available to regulators, and I think our competitors might feel the same way as well. So I'll just note a few things there regarding transparency, which LV asked about. But Edwin, I'm sure you have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Albert, for this taking up this point of transparency, because I can really understand what you say. In the end, maybe to add that a little bit, in the end, it's about, as I said, meaningful transparency. Does the consumer understand the information that's actually handed out? And it's not about more and more information. We know, under current laws and regulations, that is the basis for a lot of our work as enforcers as well. Are companies transparent enough about the rules and conditions? But under the DSA, it's not only the infrastructure that should be transparent, it's also the specific communication about products and services that should be really understood. And I think in that way, we should work more together as enforcers and companies and platforms to discover what is meaningful transparency. And that's a path upon we'd really like to set the next steps with several platforms to find out what it is and how compliance culture in the context of companies can add to that wish.
I mean, one of the issues with online marketplace, which is from Silke Lalveni, the head of public affairs.
We lost you, Ivy.
Right, I think she was raising a question the audience had on secondary ticketing, I guess, on platforms. I think she'll go back in shortly, I'm sure. Yeah, it's certainly not something we typically do on our platform. So I'm not sure I have much to contribute, but maybe the others might have some experience with this one.
If I may probably come in, waiting for our moderator. I'm just reading the question itself, and it's about secondary ticketing market, but the link is also to that those may come from operators established outside Europe, because otherwise I could only have said, well, anything that is illegal is covered by this proposal, and we're not now going category by category. But quite obviously, the DSA is also very different from the e-commerce directive in that it applies to anybody selling into Europe. So that was, of course, important in the e-commerce directive at the time. That was sort of limited to whoever was established in Europe because it endowed more rights, actually, access to the single market than it contained obligations on operators. Now, since the bulk of the DSA is about due diligence obligations in order to keep our users and consumers safe, that naturally applies to anybody wherever they are established. So quite naturally, that is one important point now of the DSA, that it applies to anybody selling into Europe.
We have another question on general monitoring, which is from Yvette Templeman of VNO NCW MKB. Do you agree that we must speak of general monitoring if specific content must be identified among the totality of the content on a platform, and that specific monitoring might only be permissible in respect of protective matter or potential infringers? Now, this is a question again for Werner, but maybe since it's been also raised by Albert and Fabienne, maybe you could come in afterwards and see how you think monitoring should be working.
Yeah, thanks for letting me start on this, because it's a very important one. And I, of course, took note of Fabienne's comments at the beginning. And you said it's a pity that there is no general monitoring obligations in the DSA. Just a few thoughts on this. I mean, first of all, you said when it comes to products and marketplaces, we're not talking about free speech, so there is no reason for not having general monitoring obligations. Just to remind you that also the freedom to conduct the business is also a fundamental right. It's always a balancing act between different rights. Second, through the Good Samaritan clause, we do actually encourage platforms to do that. When we talk to marketplaces that say, well, we use artificial intelligence to identify counterfeit products, well, obviously that's what we want them to do. But there's one thing of us putting in law, every platform has to have filters in place and uploads filters and what have you. That would be disproportionate. But that doesn't matter that specific monitoring obligations cannot be imposed through the orders. There is Article 8, which regulates the orders to be issued by enforcement authorities. And that has happened in the past, and it will happen in the future. But then it has to be specific. I mean, just think of the German case of the Stocker chairs, for instance. And that was a specific general monitoring obligation, which was imposed by judicial authorities and which is perfectly in line with the DSA. So the absence of a general monitoring obligation in the DSA does not mean that specific monitoring obligations cannot be imposed on an ad hoc basis.
If I may, yes, if I may. So just to answer quickly on the 3 points that you raised, I hear you on the freedom to conduct business, but it's a balancing act, as you said several times, making sure also that consumers are protected, and there is a strong process in place in the DSA that allows sellers to appeal any measure that they would be subject to, and I think that is sufficient to ensure the balance that I was referring to earlier. The Good Samaritan protection, we're not convinced, to be honest, that it's going to change much compared to the existing situation, because at the moment we know some platforms are doing are taking some proactive measures, and the thing is that we don't know exactly what they're doing. We don't know how efficient the measures are. And the situation is not going to change with the DSA and the Good Samaritan protection. They will always be free to do what they want to do, and they will not necessarily become more accountable. So that's why we believe that a legally binding obligation is really the only way to move the needle on this. And third, with orders that you mentioned. Yes, it's true, there is this possibility in the DSA, but from a practical standpoint, it's impossible for us, as it is for any rights owners, to go to court for each single counterfeit item that's being sold on platforms and that we notify. It's just impossible. It's not going to work. That's why we believe that a stay down obligation, which would require platforms to do what they can, and vis-a-vis only content that's been previously notified, to try to prevent reappearance from that content. That would be the only way to make it more efficient.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and say a few things as well. First off, we talked, of course, a little bit about balancing, right, between the right to do business and obviously about the brand's rights as well. In fact, Alibaba is kind of in an interesting position, right, because a lot of the brands like Chanel are also our customers. They may open stores on our platform, and through those stores sell into various markets like China. And in fact, Chanel is a member of our Alibaba Anti-Counterfeiting Alliance. So I think from that perspective, there's certainly alignment on sort of the end goal trying to prevent these counterfeiting items. And so we're talking about perhaps, sort of degrees of responsibility of the platform. I think certainly the DSA, as I understand, tries to strike a bit of a balance there, right? We talked a little bit about the Good Samaritan clause and AI, which we mentioned. In fact, Alibaba on our side, we do use AI tools to try to prevent counterfeit listings on our platform. Of course, as we all know, there are folks that are equally unscrupulous trying to circumvent those tools. So it's never 100% perfect, but those are some things that platforms like ourselves are trying to deploy to improve our ability to block those counterfeiting listings. I also think in terms of the notice and takedown, which we obviously implement, and the 3 strikes that Fabian mentioned, I think those are all appropriate things for platforms to implement working with the brand. So those are things, again, we do today and that we support as well.
We have a question on sanctions from Benjamin Nate of LVMH, and it's talking about the exemption of liability and that's conditional on certain obligations laid down in the DSA. And should a first sanction perhaps be that you'd lose the benefits of the exemption? Now, this is a hypothetical, but I'd like to put it to both Albert and Fabienne. Do you think that would be useful?
Yes, that's the short answer. No, I agree. That's something that would probably be even more efficient than financial sanctions. So definitely.
Well, I think no surprise, we probably would take slightly a different view on that one. But rather than debate over that, I think again I would come back to platforms like ourselves are actually motivated to have a clean platform, because at the end of the day, that's the only way we can maintain a long-term business and a long-term relationship with both brands. Again, brands who are themselves our customers and customers who purchase products on our platform. We do think sort of the first sanction for not complying would be, quite a harsh outcome, I would say, just given sizes of certain platforms, a number of transactions that run through our platform. So I would probably respectfully disagree with that suggestion, but I do think the end goal is something we want to get to as well.
Since we lost the moderator again, I take the liberty of just taking the floor as well on this liability versus responsibility or sanctions part. I would disagree that this would be more effective. We're also pursuing a double approach anyway. It's a parallel track. The liability framework stays in place. And it's even a bit reinforced, as Edwin said in his introduction, because there's also some clarification as to when you are no longer benefiting from Article 5, the hosting article. If the consumer can't see the difference anymore between the platform and the seller, but still the liability framework stays there, and the threat of being exposed to liability stays there for whoever, how small or big you are. But that's a case-by-case assessment. But it's also, and I alluded to that earlier, it is still complicated because the positive liability as such comes from somewhere else. There must be some legal framework that establishes liability. Now you fail to act in one way or the other as a platform. So now people can take you to court, but then they still must prove that you have done what you may be potentially liable, and may have to prove the relationship between, or the causality between the damage and the trader or uploader. That can be quite cumbersome, actually. What the due diligence framework actually says is this applies always, and by default, it's not case by case. It just says that whatever you do, you have to comply with all those due diligence obligations, and they can be enforced. So you will be punished if you don't have the systems in place. And there is many of those. And I listed them at the beginning of my intervention. And they go even further once you become bigger. And we have not discussed much the very large online platforms. There it goes even further in terms of obligations and external auditing. And the risk mitigation measures having to be effective. It's also more transparent. There's also more accountability around that. So I wouldn't say it would be too simple to say, had we only changed the liability framework, we would all consumers would be safe. It would be very complicated, actually. We think this double approach is very much effective.
Edwin, could you come in?
Yeah, there's not so much to add from me on this point, actually. I think it's the interesting discussion in which you see the different positions that are stated there. For me, it remains important from, again, the enforcement perspective that the DSA definitely stimulates and motivates companies themselves to get their compliance culture in order. And it both ways, well, we'll have to see how it will work out in practice, but I think it has some prerequisites now that will be able to support that point.
We've talked a lot about what the DSA is and what the DSA isn't. And I wanted to put a counterfactual to Fabienne and to Albert and to Edwin. If the DSA was adopted as it is, which may not be the case given that we're only starting in the Parliament and Council negotiations, would it be problematic? Are there things in there that right now would cause issues for you? Fabienne.
Well, yes, absolutely. I think, as I said, there would be a few improvements if the DSA were to stay as is, but fundamentally we believe that the illegal products issue and the counterfeit product issue that we have at the moment would not be addressed in a significant way. And it would be a missed opportunity because, as I said, the DSA will be valid for many years to come. So it would be a shame, basically. And once again, we're not talking about fundamentally changing the DSA, but really to bring specific adaptations, improvements on very, very important issues in a way that, that balances the different interests at stake. So in other words, we believe it's possible.
Yeah, thank you, Fabienne. I'd like to add to this, actually, to the question that I've posed to us. Are you able to work with the DSA as such, as it is not being changed anymore? The perspective I'd like to put is a little bit different. I know there's a lot to be talked about still, and there's also a risk of losing a lot of worth that is in the DSA in this phase as it is now. So actually, yes, I'd be quite happy if it remains as it is now, because we are putting ourselves way ahead in the future. Of course, we have several wishes to make things stronger and more specific, and that should be dealt with. That's some of the remarks I also put in my introductory remarks. But I definitely hope, that's the biggest hope, that we will not lose the strength of the proposals in the coming months.
Well, I think this is, again, a very good question, and I guess what they say about compromise. Maybe you don't get everything that you want, and if all of us have some things we want to change in it, then ultimately it probably means that Werner has done his job and put forth something that gets us each some of what we want and some of what we'd like to change, right? I think from a marketplace perspective, certainly, again, there are provisions that we think make good sense, and there are certainly a couple that we'd like to at least have further clarifications on. In particular, I would say regarding Article 5, sort of having more clarity on when a platform may lose the liability shield. We talk. The language talks about when an average and reasonably well-informed consumer believes that the information is provided by the platform, then they have the right to go against the platform. We as a platform obviously would like to see more clarity, and maybe even a safe harbor around that particular provision, because, as is stated, it currently could subject us to a lot of uncertainty regarding what a reasonable consumer might believe, right? Particularly when I think platforms are also trying to offer some additional services to their sellers, and in the course of offering some of those services, could that cause some confusion in that regard? I'll give you a very simple example. I talked about live streaming, right? If a platform has its own live streaming service, and it's employs live streamers to help sellers sort of pitch their pitch their products, does that then subject the platform, because it offers that live streaming service, to direct liability to consumers, right? So that piece, I think we'd love to see a little bit more clarity, and perhaps some defined safe harbors. I think the other piece we talked about already around having this apply to small enterprises and platforms as well. Probably a third part is just around the Article 18, mandatory out-of-court settlement provision. I think we like to see that not being mandatory, because it does force us into certain binding settlement processes with consumers, and we would like consumers and sellers to have their own sort of contractual choice in that regard. But again, there are plenty of good things also in the DSA that we like. So on balance, as I said, it's probably a compromise that we can live with, and maybe others who've commented probably could live with as well.
Right, it looks like we lost Aoife again, so thanks for bearing with us. Werner, Aoife, I think, wanted to ask you if there was something that you were particularly worried about losing from the proposal. So I don't know if that's too cruel a question.
That's a very cruel question. We worked long and hard on the proposal. Well, probably I would not want to lose the balance of the proposal, which we have discussed so many times now. And of course, we will. How many discussions we will ever have on this? We will never fully agree that we found the right balance, because that's the problem of balance. That only very few people are sitting in the middle of a balance, but rather on one of the sides. Yeah, we are pretty confident at our stage that we have done a good job here in balancing out those interests. That there may be need for improvements here and there, more clarity, and as Albert said, if some of the provisions are not clear enough, I mean, that would be bad, of course. Yeah, whether you agree with them or not, at least you should be clear about what you agree to or not agree to. So, but that is something I think that which we always learn from the negotiations with the other institutions, and of all the workshops like today's workshops, because all the questions, all the arguments raised are valid arguments, of course. Yeah. So we are never dismissive and say, no, that's completely, crazy as a question or as a position. But at the end of the day, once we have all agreed where to land, at least we should be very, very clear about what everybody has to do.
Thank you very much. And when I understand this is your baby, this is something that you hope to see adopted as much as possible in its state. We've had a great discussion today, and this is something that isn't going to stop. It's something that will continue for months to come. If we're here again in a year, we hopefully not in our home offices, but on a platform somewhere that will be much better connection-wise. We're going to move to a lunch break now, and the conference will resume at 1 o'clock with a keynote speech from Gerard de Graaf, But I'd like you all to raise a virtual applause for our wonderful panel, who've been very patient, especially with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.